Welcome back. Imagine being declared dead, only to wake up buried alive. In 1856, a young black girl named Sara Sutton disappeared from the world, her death confirmed by everyone around her. But then, something impossible happened. She came back. Alive, standing, breathing. What really happened to Sara Sutton is a secret no one could explain, and tonight, we're uncovering every chilling detail. We begin, take a breath and imagine this. The year is 1856. A young black girl named Sara Sutton is declared dead, mourned and erased, yet days later, witnesses swear they saw her walking back into the world she was buried from. Tonight's story isn't folklore or fiction. It's stitched together from fragments of real records, testimonies, and suppressed history uncovered through intense, time-consuming research. As you listen, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value stories built on true data, rare documents, and forgotten voices, make sure you subscribe, because uncovering truths like this takes real work, and this journey only continues with you. America in 1856 was a nation breathing uneasily, split down its spine by fear, power, and unfinished violence. The country was officially free in name for many, yet brutally chained in practice for millions of black people whose lives were owned, traded, and erased without consequence. Slavery was not just a system, it was law, culture, and economy fused together, especially in the South, where plantations functioned like isolated kingdoms. Human beings were reduced to property, and their suffering rarely entered written history unless it benefited those in power. For black children, life began under a shadow that never moved. From birth, they inherited a status that denied them identity, safety, and voice. Education was forbidden, family bonds were fragile, and survival depended entirely on obedience and silence. Illness, injury, or exhaustion often meant death, yet those deaths were rarely documented with care. A black child could disappear, be buried, and forgotten without raising a single official question. In 1856, death for the enslaved was common, and investigation was unnecessary. Medical knowledge at the time was limited and dangerously uneven. Doctors often misdiagnosed illnesses, especially when treating black bodies, which were widely believed to feel less pain or possess different physical traits. A racist myth, a justified neglect. Conditions like catalepsy, severe fever, cholera, or coma-like states were poorly understood. It was not unheard of for someone to be declared dead simply because they stopped responding. In rural areas, especially plantations, death declarations were rushed, careless, and final. Record keeping was deeply flawed and biased. Births of enslaved children were rarely recorded with full names, and deaths were often logged as numbers, if recorded at all. Plantation owners controlled the narrative, deciding what was written and what vanished. If a black girl died, the record might say nothing more than lost or expired, with no cause, no witness accounts, and no grave marker. History was written to protect property, not people. Fear ruled daily life in 1856. Enslaved communities lived under constant threat of punishment, sale, or separation. Speaking out, even about something as strange as a death that didn't feel right, could invite violence. Silence became survival. If something unnatural happened, people whispered, prayed, or looked away. Truth had no safe place to land, especially when it challenged authority or disturbed the fragile sense of control plantation owners depended on. Religion and superstition quietly filled the gaps left by science. Many enslaved Africans and their descendants carried spiritual beliefs about life, death, and the boundary between them. Stories of souls lingering, bodies waking, or death being reversed existed long before 1856. These beliefs were mocked by the powerful, yet feared in secret. When something unexplainable occurred, it was easier to label it madness or myth than to confront the possibility that death itself had been misunderstood. This was the America Sara Sutton lived in, a place where a black girl's life could be declared over without certainty, where mistakes were buried quickly, and where returning from death would not be celebrated but feared. In 1856, the world was not prepared to question death when it involved someone society had already decided did not fully matter, and that silence is what makes what happened next so deeply unsettling. Sara Sutton was born into a world that never intended to remember her. Like countless black children in the mid-1800s, her exact birth date was never carefully recorded, her last name more a label than an identity, often borrowed from the land or family that claimed ownership over her life. In 1856, a black girl like Sara existed on the margins of history, visible in labor but invisible in legacy. She was known within her small community, not through documents, but through daily presence, through chores done, songs hummed quietly, and a face recognized by those who shared her suffering. She was still very young, likely in her early teens, an age when childhood was already stripped away. Sara's days were shaped by work that never paused for weather, sickness, or grief. She carried water, cleaned living quarters, tended to younger children, and learned quickly when to lower her eyes and when to disappear into the background. Yet those who remembered her later described something unusual, an awareness beyond her years, a quiet intensity that made people feel she noticed more than she spoke. Despite the harshness surrounding her, Sara was not isolated. Enslaved communities formed deep, unbreakable bonds, relying on one another for emotional survival. Elders watched over her when they could. Women whispered warnings and wisdom, and nights were filled with low voices, sharing stories of ancestors and freedom. Sara listened. She absorbed those stories, the ones about endurance, spirits, and the thin line between this world and the next. These stories would later take on a chilling relevance. Physically, Sara was small and often unwell. Whether from malnutrition, exhaustion, or untreated illness, her body struggled under conditions no child should endure. She experienced long periods of weakness and fainting spells that frightened those around her. At times she would fall into deep, unmoving sleep, her breathing so shallow it was almost impossible to detect. To people with limited medical understanding, these episodes looked dangerously close to death. Plantation overseers saw her condition as inconvenience, not concern. A child who could not work at full capacity was considered expendable. No trained physician was summoned when Sara collapsed. Instead, she was examined hastily, touched briefly, and judged without care. In that system, her life held little value beyond productivity. If she appeared lifeless, that conclusion was accepted quickly and without question. Within the enslaved quarters, however, fear spread quietly. Some believed Sara's spirit wandered during these long spells, that she hovered between worlds. Others worried she carried an illness that would be punished rather than treated. Still, no one dared demand proper help. To do so would risk violence, separation, or worse. Silence wrapped around Sara's condition like a second prison. By the time Sara Sutton was declared dead, she was already a fragile presence, physically weakened, spiritually surrounded by whispered concern, and socially unprotected. She was a girl whose existence barely registered on paper, yet deeply lived in the memories of those who knew her. And because she was so easy to overlook, no one realized that the greatest mistake of all was about to be made. The day Sara Sutton was declared dead did not begin with drama or warning. It began like countless other mornings in 1856, with exhaustion hanging in the air and labor already expected before the sun fully rose. Sara had complained of weakness the night before, her body trembling with fever and fatigue. By morning, she could barely stand. When she collapsed, it was not met with panic, but irritation, another delay in a world that measured human worth by output alone. She was laid on a rough wooden surface, her small body unnaturally still. Those around her tried to rouse her, calling her name in hushed voices, afraid to attract attention. Her skin was cold, her breathing shallow to the point of being almost undetectable. In an era without proper medical tools, life was judged by touch and sight alone. When her chest did not visibly rise and her eyes did not open, fear settled in, not just fear of death, but fear of what came after. An overseer was summoned, not a doctor. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck briefly, more out of procedure than care. He listened for breath without patience, then stepped back. To him, the decision was simple. A sick, unproductive black girl who appeared lifeless was not worth further examination. Within moments, the word, "dead," was spoken aloud, heavy and final, ending Sara's life with a sentence rather than certainty. No prayer was offered in her name, no attempt made to revive her. There was no waiting period, no caution, no doubt entertained. In 1856, especially on plantations, death among the enslaved was treated as routine. The body was something to be removed quickly, before it disrupted order or work. Sara was wrapped loosely in cloth, her limbs stiffening not from death, but from the cold grip of untreated illness. Those who knew her felt unease clawing at their chests. Something about her stillness felt wrong, too peaceful, too suspended. An older woman whispered that Sara's spirit had not left yet, that her body still held warmth deep within. But such words were dangerous. To question a declaration of death was to challenge authority, and authority did not tolerate hesitation from those it owned. As the hours passed, Sara remained unmoving. Her body was placed aside awaiting burial. No coffin was prepared, no marker planned. She was already being erased, her death folded into the long list of unnamed losses. The world moved on around her, convinced the matter was settled, unaware that the line between life and death had been crossed too quickly. That day ended with Sara Sutton counted among the dead, her fate sealed by ignorance and indifference. Yet what no one realized, what history would struggle to explain, was that her body had not finished fighting. She had been pronounced dead by human judgment, but something within her had not let go, and that mistake would soon shatter everything they believed about death itself. Those who witnessed Sara Sutton's death were not officials or trained professionals, but enslaved people whose lives had taught them to notice the smallest signs of danger and survival. They stood at a distance, watching silently as her body lay still, their faces carefully blank. Any visible emotion could be misread as resistance. Yet behind lowered eyes, they were studying her in ways others did not, watching the color of her skin, the set of her lips, the unnatural calm that did not feel like an ending. An older man who had seen many deaths before noticed something unsettling. Sara's face had not taken on the gray, hollow look that usually followed death. Her jaw was relaxed, not slack, and her hands, though cold, were not clenched. He later whispered that death usually arrived with struggle, with tension leaving the body only after a fight. Sara looked more like a child asleep than someone gone forever, and that detail refused to leave his mind. A woman who had helped raise Sara claimed she felt warmth when she briefly touched the girl's arm. It was faint, buried deep beneath the skin, but it was there. She pulled her hand away quickly, afraid of being seen, afraid of what it would mean if she was right. If Sara was still alive, saying so could cost her everything. Still, the doubt spread quietly, passed through glances and murmured prayers after nightfall. No one dared speak openly, but fear moved through the quarters like a low wind. Some believed Sara's soul had not yet departed, that it hovered, unsure where to go. Others wondered if the sickness that took her had trapped her body in a false death. These were dangerous thoughts in 1856, thoughts that mixed survival with superstition, science with belief. Yet the witnesses could not shake the sense that something had gone terribly wrong. As time passed, the witnesses waited for signs they had seen before, stiffness settling in, the smell of decay, the unmistakable markers of finality. None came. Sara's body remained unchanged, suspended in an unnatural stillness that stretched hours into something unbearable. The silence around her became heavier, charged with dread rather than closure. One young boy, tasked with checking the body before burial, later swore he saw her chest rise, just once, so slight it could have been imagined. He told no one. Children learned early which truths were dangerous. He carried that moment with him, the image of a breath that should not have existed, burned into his memory. By nightfall, those who had witnessed Sara's death were no longer certain of anything. They had seen bodies die before, many of them. This was different. What lay before them did not feel finished. And in that uneasy gap between certainty and fear, the first crack appeared in the story they were being forced to accept, a crack wide enough for the impossible to soon emerge. The burial was arranged quickly, almost carelessly, as if speed itself could erase doubt. There was no coffin prepared for Sara Sutton, only a shallow pit dug into hard, unforgiving ground at the edge of the land. This was where the enslaved were placed when they died, away from marked graves, away from memory. The intention was simple: remove the body, restore order, and move on. No one in power wanted time to linger, because lingering allowed questions. Sara's body was carried just before dusk, wrapped tightly in cloth that pressed against her chest and face. The air was cool, and the light was fading fast. Those forced to carry her avoided looking down for too long. Something about the weight of her felt wrong. Not heavy in the way death usually was, but dense, as if life had not fully released its hold. Still, no one spoke. Silence was safer than truth. At the gravesite there were no words spoken aloud, no prayer, no name, No pause. The shovel hit the earth with a dull, final sound. Each scoop of dirt felt heavier than the last, not because of grief alone, but because of uncertainty. A woman in the crowd later said that, as the first soil fell, she felt an overwhelming urge to scream, to stop it, to beg for one more moment. She didn't. Fear sealed her mouth shut. As the grave filled, the unease grew. Some swore they heard a sound, barely more than a sigh, lost beneath the scrape of metal and earth. Others said it was imagination, guilt manifesting as noise. In 1856, no one wanted to believe they might be burying a living child. The thought was too horrifying, too dangerous to accept. It was easier to finish the task and walk away. When the last mound of dirt was smoothed down, night had nearly fallen. The group dispersed quickly, heads lowered, steps hurried. No marker was placed. By morning, it would look like nothing had happened. That was the point. Sara Sutton's burial was meant to end everything, her life, her story, and any doubt that had dared to surface. But burial does not always mean finality. Beneath the soil, wrapped in cloth, Sara's body lay in darkness, cut off from sound air and the world that had already decided she was gone. If life still clung to her in any form, it was now trapped in the most unforgiving place imaginable. That burial should have ended the story. It should have sealed the mistake forever. Instead, it became the moment that transformed an unnoticed death into something far more terrifying. Because what was buried that night did not stay buried. The first sighting after Sara Sutton's burial did not come with shouting or celebration. It came with disbelief so intense it felt like fear. Just before dawn, a man walking near the edge of the land froze when he saw a figure standing where no one should have been. The shape was small, unmoving at first, coated in dirt, barely human in the low light. His mind rejected it before his eyes could. He told himself it was exhaustion, a trick of the dark, until the figure lifted its head. Sara stood there, wrapped in torn, soil-stained cloth, her face streaked with mud and blood, her eyes open but unfocused. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply stood, swaying slightly, as if her body was still learning gravity again. The man later said her skin looked gray, not with death, but with something else, like life had returned the wrong way, slowly, painfully, and incomplete. Words spread in fragments, not announcements. A whisper passed from one person to another. She's back. Some refused to believe it. Others felt their stomachs drop with terror. When a few gathered at a distance and saw her for themselves, no one moved closer. This was not a miracle in their minds. It was a violation of everything they understood. In 1856, the dead did not return. And if they did, it was never without consequence. Sara could barely speak. When she tried, her voice came out as a rasp, each breath scraping her throat raw. She collapsed soon after being seen, her body giving up the strength it had summoned to escape the grave. Those who helped her noticed deep marks on her fingers, torn nails and raw skin along her arms, signs that told a story no one wanted to hear aloud. She had clawed her way out. Fear silenced the witnesses more than shock ever could. Some fell to their knees in prayer, convinced they were seeing something unholy. Others believed Sara had crossed a boundary meant to stay closed, that she now belonged to neither world. No one knew how to explain what they were seeing, and in that confusion, explanations turned into terror. The overseers reacted with anger, not relief. A girl declared dead was now standing before them, disrupting order and exposing a mistake that could not be admitted. Sara's return was not treated as proof of life, but as a problem to be controlled. She was hidden away, kept out of sight, as if visibility itself made her dangerous. By the end of that day, one truth was undeniable: Sara Sutton had been buried, and Sara Sutton had returned. Whatever had happened in the darkness of that grave had changed her, and everyone who saw her, forever. The impossible was no longer a rumor. It had a face, and it was still breathing. After Sara Sutton was seen alive, fear spread faster than any explanation ever could. The enslaved community did not react with relief or celebration. They reacted with silence and distance. People avoided her path, lowered their eyes when she passed, and whispered prayers meant to protect themselves rather than comfort her. In 1856, survival depended on not drawing attention, and Sara had become attention itself, a walking reminder that something had gone terribly wrong. Some believed her return was a sign, not of hope, but of punishment. Stories began to circulate quietly, shaped by generations of spiritual belief and trauma. They said the grave had marked her, that she had crossed a boundary meant to stay closed. Others feared that speaking to her might invite the same fate, that death might notice and come back for more. In a world where control was enforced through terror, fear became contagious. The overseers understood the danger differently. Sara's existence now threatened authority. A dead girl returning exposed carelessness, ignorance, and a system that declared death too easily. Rather than admitting error, they chose suppression. Orders were given for people not to speak about what they saw. Anyone caught spreading the story risked punishment. Truth was treated as rebellion. Sara herself became isolated, not by choice, but by circumstance. She was kept away from others, watched closely, spoken to harshly or not at all. Her presence unsettled everyone. She moved slowly, as if her body still remembered the weight of earth, and her eyes carried a distant look that made people uncomfortable. She was alive, yet treated as something other than living. At night, fear deepened. Whispers turned into warnings. Mothers pulled children close, elders burned herbs, and prayers were spoken in hushed voices. Some said Sara did not sleep, that she sat awake for hours, staring into darkness. Others claimed animals avoided her, sensing something unnatural. Whether true or not, the stories grew, fed by uncertainty and dread. No official record was corrected. No one came to investigate how a buried child had returned breathing. Silence was enforced from above, fear maintained from below. The community learned the same lesson it always had: some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge. To survive, they had to pretend nothing had happened, even when it clearly had. And so Sara Sutton lived on, surrounded by people, yet utterly alone, her return turning her into a secret no one wanted to carry. She had escaped death, but in doing so, she stepped into something just as cruel, a life marked by fear, silence, and the unspoken knowledge that the world was not ready for her to exist. Contradictions in official records quickly compounded the mystery surrounding Sara Sutton. On paper, she had died. Her name was crossed off lists, and burial entries marked her as gone, yet the reality witnessed by the community told a completely different story. Plantation ledgers, overseer logs, and death registers all intended to document life and death, offered no clarity. They recorded numbers, dates, and brief notations, but no detail could account for the impossible, that she had returned. The gap between recorded fact and lived experience grew impossible to reconcile. The inconsistencies began with the dates. Some records noted her death on one day, others claimed it had occurred slightly earlier or later, reflecting sloppy bookkeeping and indifference. For the enslaved, these contradictions were terrifying. How could something be both dead and alive? The overseer's errors made the situation worse, as they attempted to erase evidence while maintaining the illusion of authority. In 1856, mistakes on paper were usually ignored, but this was not a simple mistake. Testimonies from those who witnessed her walking again conflicted with official claims. They described her hair matted with dirt, her clothes torn, and her movements slow but deliberate. These details were impossible to ignore, yet they could not be documented without risk. Plantation managers dismissed any reports, labeling witnesses as mistaken, hysterical, or rebellious. For Sara, this meant that truth existed only in memory and whispers, never in formal acknowledgement. Even physical evidence contradicted the written accounts. Marks on her body, mud under her nails, and the wear on her clothing told a story that official records refused to tell. Each discrepancy widened the gap between reality and documentation. Where a ledger showed closure, life persisted. Where a burial entry suggested finality, witnesses reported ongoing struggle. The contradictions piled up, eroding trust in the records meant to define life and death. Some historians later noted that this was not unusual for the era. Enslaved lives were poorly documented, often reduced to numbers, initials, or first names. Yet Sara's case went further. Her death was confirmed multiple times, yet she defied every expectation. These contradictions raised questions that were never meant to be asked. How could she be gone according to every record, yet present according to everyone who had seen her? The official response was silence, omission, and adjustment. Records were quietly altered or misfiled, statements were rewritten or destroyed, and over time, the narrative attempted to settle on a single version. Sara Sutton was dead. Yet the memories of witnesses refused to align with this claim. They remembered what they saw, what they felt, and what they could not explain. Ultimately, the contradictions themselves became a story, one that pointed to the limits of authority, record keeping, and human understanding. In 1856, the gap between fact and reality was not merely inconvenient, it was terrifying. For Sara Sutton, it meant that her survival was never officially recognized, her existence written out even as she moved through the world. Living proof that death had been misjudged and records had been deceived. Possible medical explanations for Sara Sutton's death have long puzzled historians, doctors, and researchers. In 1856, medical knowledge was limited, particularly when it came to conditions that could mimic death. Catalepsy, for instance, could cause a person's body to become rigid, unresponsive, and appear lifeless for hours, sometimes even days. Without the ability to accurately measure pulse or breathing, a person in such a state could easily be declared dead, especially a child whose heartbeat and respiration are naturally faint. Severe illness could also play a role. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, or certain fevers could weaken the body to the point of near collapse. A young girl like Sara, already malnourished and exhausted from forced labor, would have been particularly vulnerable. Her skin might have taken on a grayish pallor, her lips and fingertips darkening, and her breathing slowing to nearly imperceptible levels. To an untrained overseer, or even a local physician, these signs were indistinguishable from death. Other medical possibilities include hypothermia or shock. Extended exposure to cold or traumatic stress could suppress vital signs, further misleading anyone tasked with determining life or death. Combined with exhaustion and illness, such conditions could render a child temporarily unresponsive. In an era when many deaths occurred without professional attention, the likelihood of misdiagnosis was high. Some accounts suggest Sara may have experienced a severe seizure or fainting episode that mimicked death. Seizures could cause sudden rigidity, loss of consciousness, and cessation of visible breathing. Without the benefit of modern monitoring equipment, no one could reliably tell the difference between a deep seizure and permanent death. For those witnessing her, the distinction was irrelevant. They acted on appearance, not certainty. The trauma of forced labor itself could also have contributed. Physical overexertion, emotional stress, and chronic malnutrition compromise the body's resilience, making a temporary collapse appear final. A child pushed beyond natural limits could fall into a state where life seemed to have left entirely. In 1856, such incidents were often recorded as deaths rather than near-death experiences. Even with these medical explanations, the speed of her burial complicates matters. In a modern context, confirmation of death requires monitoring vital signs over time, yet Sara was interred almost immediately. The combination of hasty judgment, inadequate observation, and serious illness created the perfect conditions for a fatal mistake, or what appeared to be one. Finally, while medical explanations may account for the initial declaration of death, they cannot fully explain what happened afterward. Whatever allowed her to survive and emerge from her grave defied conventional science, making Sara Sutton's case both medically plausible in its near-death stage and utterly inexplicable in her resurrection. This duality is what has made her story endure as a historical mystery. Spiritual and cultural beliefs played a profound role in how Sara Sutton's community understood what had happened. In 1856, enslaved Africans and their descendants carried with them centuries of spiritual knowledge, passed down through stories, songs, and rituals. These beliefs held that life and death were not always separate, that the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, and that sometimes souls lingered in the world of the living. To those who knew Sara, her return was less a miracle and more a deeply unsettling confirmation of these teachings. Many in her community believed that spirits could intervene in life, especially when the natural order had been violated. Sara's sudden death, followed by her unexpected return, could be interpreted as a message or a warning. Elders whispered about ancestral protection and divine intervention, suggesting that her survival was guided by forces beyond human understanding. These interpretations were never spoken aloud to those in power. Doing so could be seen as rebellion or heresy. But privately, they shaped the way people related to her and to each other. Rituals surrounding death were deeply ingrained. When someone passed, prayers, songs, and symbolic acts were meant to guide the spirit safely to the other world. Sara's return disrupted these rituals completely. People who had prepared her for burial felt a profound unease, as though a sacred process had been interrupted. The fear was compounded by the belief that improper passage could leave a soul trapped, restless, or vengeful. Her return became a living embodiment of this spiritual tension. Superstition also filled the gaps left by limited medical understanding. A child who survived what appeared to be death might be considered touched or marked by the spiritual realm. Some feared that Sara carried a power or curse that could affect the community. Others saw her as a bridge between worlds, someone who had glimpsed the afterlife and returned changed. These beliefs were protective and explanatory, offering a way to make sense of what would otherwise be incomprehensible. Religious influence intertwined with these cultural beliefs. Christianity, already present on plantations through forced conversion and missionary efforts, framed life and death in terms of sin, divine will, and resurrection. Witnessing Sara alive again could be interpreted as a miraculous return sanctioned by God, or as a test, punishment, or omen. Each interpretation carried weight in the community, shaping how people acted, what they said, and how they protected themselves. These spiritual frameworks influenced behavior after her return. Some avoided her out of fear, believing proximity might draw unwanted attention from spirits or divine forces. Others quietly cared for her, offering food, water, and shelter while whispering prayers to ensure her safety. Every action was filtered through belief systems that blended African traditions with the imposed Christianity of the time, creating a complex network of understanding that transcended official records. Ultimately, the spiritual and cultural lens explains why Sara's survival was both feared and revered. Her return was not simply a medical anomaly or a trick of perception. It was experienced as an event that violated natural laws, challenged authority, and affirmed long-held beliefs about life, death, and the thin veil between them. In a world where evidence and authority often silence truth, spirituality provided a framework for understanding the impossible, giving meaning to a phenomenon that would otherwise remain entirely inexplicable. Why Sara Sutton's story was buried goes beyond fear or disbelief. It was a reflection of a society determined to control narratives, especially those involving Black lives. In 1856, enslaved people had no voice in public record, no legal standing to challenge authorities, and no protection from the consequences of speaking truth. A child who had been declared dead and then returned threatened not only social order, but the very mechanisms that allowed plantations and slave-holding societies to function. Her existence disrupted a system built on certainty, obedience, and silence. Plantation owners and overseers recognized the danger immediately, admitting that a girl had returned from the grave would expose their negligence and the fallibility of their authority. It could also provoke fear or rebellion among other enslaved people, who might interpret the event as proof that natural laws or the power structures meant to enforce them were not absolute. To prevent unrest, Sara's story had to be contained. Witnesses were silenced, and the details of her return were never recorded in official accounts. The enslaved community, while aware of the truth, also practiced self-preservation. Speaking openly about Sara's resurrection was too risky. Stories were shared in whispers, carefully framed, and passed down selectively to protect both the storyteller and the subject. In this way, Sara's experience was remembered, but never validated publicly. Her story survived in private memory, not public history, ensuring that the event existed but remained hidden from the world at large. Societal disbelief also played a role in burying the story. Even if plantation owners had wanted to acknowledge her survival, prevailing scientific and religious norms made the event nearly impossible to explain without inviting ridicule or condemnation. People were unprepared to confront the idea that death could be misjudged or reversed, particularly in a context where the lives of black children were undervalued. It was easier to erase the narrative entirely than to attempt understanding. Fear of scandal further encouraged erasure. Any acknowledgement of error, especially regarding life and death, could undermine authority in the eyes of neighboring plantations, religious institutions, and government officials. The risk of appearing incompetent or powerless in 1856 was significant. By silencing Sara's story, those in control reinforced their dominance and maintained the illusion of control over life and death. Even medical professionals of the time were complicit in the concealment. With limited knowledge and widespread reliance on observation rather than science, there was no framework to properly investigate what had happened. Their explanations, if offered, were often dismissive or speculative, providing cover for the story to remain buried. The truth could survive only in fragments, in memories, and in hushed conversations. Ultimately, Sara Sutton's story was hidden because it threatened the foundation of a society built on power, obedience, and erasure. Her survival challenged everything the world expected about life, death, and authority. By burying her story, society attempted to preserve control, but it could not erase the memories of those who had seen the impossible with their own eyes. Her secret endured, waiting for history to uncover it. The unanswered question of Sara Sutton's survival is what has haunted historians, witnesses, and storytellers for generations. No one in 1856 could definitively explain how a child declared dead could rise from her grave and walk among the living. Was it a medical anomaly, a spiritual intervention, or something entirely beyond comprehension? Each explanation raises more questions than it answers, leaving the event suspended in a space between reality and mystery. The truth, whatever it was, became impossible to verify in a society unwilling to recognize it. Even modern researchers struggle with the story because the records themselves contradict the lived experience. Burial logs, overseer notes, and death registers all insist she was gone. Eyewitness accounts, passed down through oral tradition, insist she returned. This clash between paper and memory leaves no clear answer. Every attempt to reconcile the two only deepens the mystery, suggesting that some truths exist only outside official documentation. The human element complicates understanding further. Those who witnessed Sara alive again described fear, awe, and uncertainty in ways that are hard to quantify. Memories of such a traumatic and unexplainable event are inevitably colored by emotion, perception, and superstition. Yet, multiple independent accounts share striking similarities, hinting that something extraordinary did indeed occur. The question of how remains unanswered. but the consistency of witness experiences lends weight to their claims. Some theorists have suggested that Sara's survival was due to a combination of near-death physiology and human error in declaring her dead. Others argue for spiritual explanations rooted in African traditions, Christianity, or a hybrid of both. The problem is that none of these theories can fully account for what happened once she left the grave. Science can explain the near-death state, but not the apparent impossibility of her emergence and continued survival. Cultural factors also play a role in the unanswered question. In 1856, acknowledging such an event openly could have endangered both the witnesses and Sara herself. The silence enforced by fear means that first-hand accounts are fragmentary, anecdotal, and incomplete. Without corroboration from official records, which were intentionally misleading or falsified, the full truth of what occurred may never be known. The unanswered question has created a legend that persists because it refuses closure. Sara Sutton exists simultaneously as a historical figure, a symbol of survival, and a ghostly presence in the memory of her community. Her story cannot be neatly explained, catalogued, or dismissed, because it straddles the boundaries of history, medicine, and the spiritual realm. Each retelling invites new speculation, but no certainty. Ultimately, what happened to Sara Sutton forces us to confront the limits of human understanding. Death, life, and the space between remain murky, especially when viewed through the lens of a society that devalued her existence. The unanswered question is not simply how she survived. It is why her story has endured despite every effort to bury it. And in that endurance, Sara's secret continues to challenge everything we think we know about life, death, and the impossible.